Okay, sorry. I didn't get it. I have to start. Okay. Hello and good evening. I'm Bettina Wenzel from the Goethe-Institut Ukraine, and I would like to welcome you to our first event of the online side program of Data CTRL Center exhibition. It will be a talk with Varoon Bashyakarla and Tetyana Bogdanova about personal data, political persuasion. But a few words about what is Data CTRL Center. It is a large-scale regional project initiated by the Goethe-Institut aimed at promoting media literacy and personal data protection on the internet. If you're in Kiev or you plan to come here until the 22nd of November, you're warmly invited to see the exhibition at the Gallery M17 here in the center of Kiev. If not, lucky you can visit the exhibition online under datactrlcenter.com. But what is it about? The main purpose of the exhibition is to regain control over your data. Who is using your data for what reason? With the help of the exhibition, we would like to show why it is so important to develop critical thinking and media literacy in modern conditions. The main mission of the format is not to intimidate, but on the contrary, to inspire a change in attitudes towards personal data, privacy, and information. The exhibition, online and offline, is curated by popular science media Kunsht from Kiev and Tactical Tech from Berlin. So I think it is enough about advertising our exhibition. Now I would like to introduce the two speakers of the evening. There is Varoon Bashyakarla. He is a data scientist at the Tactical Tech, a Berlin-based NGO that works at the intersection of activism and technology. His work explores how our personal data is being used for political influence around the world. His team has partners with academics, journalists, policymakers, and researchers in over 36 countries in the process of conducting this work. Previously, Varun worked in Silicon Valley as a data scientist. He was also a fellow at the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Data Science for Social Good Fellowship, a Transatlantic Digital Debates Fellow, and most recently a recipient of the McCloy Fellowship on Global Trends from the American Council on Germany. Varun received his bachelor's degree in statistics and economics from Yale University. Then there is Tatyana Bogdanova. She's an elections and civil society development specialist and a researcher of technology's impact on democracy. In 2020, she completed a fellowship at the Prague Civil Society Center investigating the use of personal data in election campaigns. Prior to that, Tatyana has worked with NGOs in Eastern Europe and Eurasia and served as a legislative education and practice program fellow with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law in Washington, D.C. Tatyana holds a master in Eastern European Studies from the Free University of Berlin and a BA in Business Administration from the International Christian University, Kiev. Now I'm really curious about their talk. They will talk about the ways in which our personal data is being used for political purposes, often in ways that are considered legitimate. Varun will illustrate how our personal data is becoming a political asset around the world, and Tatyana will talk about how voters' data is utilized by Ukrainian political entities. The floor is yours, you both.
Hi, Bettina. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here. I want to fit in a lot into just a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to jump right in. We'll just be talking briefly about our personal data, this larger topic of political influence. And of course, because today is the day of the US elections, I thought it would be nice to look at examples largely from the United States. Now, I just want to make sure the slides are up. Let me see if I can get this going. There we go. Perfect. Next slide, please. Great. Just to start off with, I thought it would be nice to just reflect for a moment about what information we leave behind when we use the internet. This is what we call our digital footprint. Maybe it's information about what we're searching online. Maybe it's information about what Wi-Fi networks we're connected to. Maybe we've handed over our information to a company and that company suffered a data breach. Maybe it's information about the kinds of photos we're posting online, or information about what kind of mood we're in, where we are. All the information is information we often leave behind when we interact with the internet. Next slide, please. And I want to start with this quote from David Gurwitz from April 2015. So it's already 5.5 years old, but it illustrates the topic so well. I'm going to read it out loud. He wrote, "What you buy, what you read, what you share online, who you associate with, what your mood is, where you work, what you do, what your health situation is, where you've donated, what clothing styles you like, what car models you buy, your favorite cola brand, your favorite phone brand, all of that information is available to those with the budget to buy it and the algorithms to aggregate and sift through it. This is where big data is changing the face of American election politics." And the reason this is happening is because there's a large network of companies who can make a lot of money from the use of our personal data for political purposes. Next slide, please. This slide shows some of their homepages. My colleagues and I have identified hundreds of such companies over the course of our research. A lot of people think that Cambridge Analytica was an exception. Yes, Cambridge Analytica was highly sensationalized and captured headlines around the world. But actually, in reality, it was quite standard with respect to the use of voters' personal data in ways that they may not well understand. And my colleagues and I have come to call this collection of companies the influence industry. And you might be wondering, what do these companies actually do? Next slide, please. My colleagues and I have grouped the tactics of this influence industry into three main categories. First, on the bottom layer is the asset layer. This is about how our personal data has become a political asset. Next, the intelligence layer, which is about how our personal data has become a source of political intelligence. And finally, the influence layer, or how our personal data has become a means for political influence. Now, as a data scientist, I prefer to think of this more in terms of the data pipeline. So the bottom layer is about the source of the data. How do you acquire it? It's about where are you getting your data from? The next layer is about the analysis of that data. What can you learn from the data that you've acquired? And finally, on the top layer is the actual application of the learnings of the data that you've collected. And that's fundamentally about what you can do with the learnings from your data to actually achieve an aim that you're interested in. Now, enough abstract talk. I thought it would be helpful to look at a couple of concrete examples to help make these ideas stick a bit more. So we'll start off with this bottom layer, the asset layer, and we'll work our way through each of the remaining two layers. Next slide, please. So when we think about where this data actually comes from that political entities use, they're companies that belong to this influence industry who make this data readily available. This is kind of standard marketing consumer data that companies like Nike's and Adidas use all the time, but now they are sort of refashioning this data and making it available for political applications. So the screenshot you see here is from a company called L2. They are an American company, and here they're advertising the data that they've collected. They're advertising access to 190 million voter records, 240 million national consumer records, access to 800 million in-home email addresses. They're writing gain access to millions of records in our voter file. They're quite open and quite proud, actually, of the volume of data that they have access to. Next slide. L2 built a partnership with another political data brokering company called Haystack DNA. And together, the two of them have kind of joined efforts. And as the text above described, for each of these issues below, they have scored every American voter on a scale from 0 to 100 with respect to their attitudes to a number of these issues. Their attitudes towards things like the importance of the opioid crisis, their attitude towards things like civil liberties or income inequality or the Trump impeachment, or the Muslim ban, or gay marriage, or how likely they are to be a Trump supporter. Every single voter on a scale from 0 to 100 is scored with respect to all of these categories shown here. And this is just a small snapshot of the larger collection of data that they actually have available. I think it's quite informative to see what these companies sell and how they communicate their services. So I want to share with you a short clip from a larger video my colleagues and I have put together, in which you can see just that. It's just a short 90-second clip from a longer video, but without any further ado, we'll start that video.
The perfect strategy. Our experts will put you in the position to be victorious, electing a president. How do you build a movement? Your revolution starts here. New Sapiens. Engaging influencers, opinion formers and decision makers. Political advertising, political services, campaign analytics. Connecting votes and candidates. India's #1 elections technology company, 96% winning record. Larry Hogan, Governor of Maryland, we're ready to ignite your cause. Political campaigns, moving at the speed of politics to build your digital army and target key voters. Dare greatly, a champion for great candidates. Elections, create preference among voters. Where political change begins, start a campaign. Interesting happens where cultures clash. Every day's a campaign. Campaigns for ideas that matter. Peaceful change, driven by people empowered by technology. Changing the world, one pixel at a time. Digital organizing to impact, change, inspire change, incite action. Behind every victory, there is a strategy.
I think it's nice to talk about these companies, but I think it's something else to see for yourself the kinds of things they sell and how they sell it as well. All right, moving on, we will now move to this middle layer of intelligence, how our personal data is becoming a source of political intelligence. Next slide, please. A lot of people don't realize it, but when you visit websites on the internet, take, for example, your favorite news site, it's not just that news site that logs your visit to that website. A lot of other companies do too, and they're able to do that through trackers that register your visits on the web. And over time, these third-party trackers, they're called third-party trackers because they are not the first party of the website that you're visiting, but they're a third-party entity. Over time, these third-party trackers can infer our habits, our preferences, and even our interests by monitoring what websites we go to and when over the course of days, weeks, and months. And we can see that too in the way companies talk about it. So the slide you're looking at was actually part of a sales deck from the American ad targeting company called Campaign Grid. This deck was accidentally leaked. And you can see from this slide, it pokes fun at internet anonymity. If you can look closely, the headline says internet users are no longer anonymous. And the reason that's the case is because of these third-party trackers that allow companies to see what voters actually do online. This allows them to learn things about us from the data that they collect. Next slide, please. Another thing that companies belonging to the influence industry do is that they're interested in understanding what voters respond to. And they do this through something called A/B testing. A/B testing is just another word for experimentation. But this is basically about testing campaign slogans, phrases, designs to see which design or slogan gives them more of what they want. So here are a couple examples. For example, during the last presidential election, the 2016 presidential election, I should clarify, not this one, but the one 4 years ago in the United States, we can see that Bernie Sanders' campaign was trying to encourage people to sign his birthday card, perhaps to get them to join a newsletter, maybe eventually try to encourage them to fundraise to the campaign. And so the campaign here is testing 3 different images of Bernie Sanders to see which one is actually more successful than the others. Same thing with the Ben Carson campaign. In this case, the images are exactly the same. However, the text next to the images are different. One says endorse Ben and receive a free bumper sticker. The other one says endorse me and I'll send you a bumper sticker. Next slide, please. Gary Kobe was the former director of digital advertising and fundraising for the Trump 2016 campaign, and for the Trump 2020 campaign, he's serving as digital director. And Izzy Lepowski from Wired interviewed him and wrote, quote, "On any given day," Kobe says, the campaign was running 40,000 to 50,000 variants of its ads. On the day of the 3rd presidential debate in October, the team ran 175,000 variations. Kobe calls this approach A/B testing on steroids. I used to run an A/B testing team at a Silicon Valley tech company, and I can tell you that we never reached a scale of testing that was nearly this vast. This is really quite unprecedented, and you can imagine that the campaign was testing tons of different variants of messages, of images, of slogans to see what was resonating most with voters. And I thought it would just be fun to do a quick test to look at these 2 banner images of Donald Trump. This is the day of this ad was shown on the day of a debate, and they're trying to get people to sign his supporter list. So just take a second and ask for yourself which which banner image you think is more effective. And next slide, please. If you guessed the one on the top, you were correct. And now moving on to the final layer, influence. This is all about how can you use the data that has been collected and that you've analyzed to actually achieve a political aim that you're interested in. Next slide. This ad was shown to a number of people on Facebook. You could probably recognize the design. It says, "Voting out the racists begins with registering to vote. Elect Democrats, save the world, Black Lives Matter, register to vote now." There's not much information about this ad, and it's natural to wonder who is paying for this. And it in fact tells us Field Team 6. So if you Google Field Team 6, you realize, next slide please, that it is in fact a Democratic voter registration group. And on their website, they talk about some of their success in the past. So for example, in 2018, they helped flip a lot of House districts in California from Republican House seats to Democratic House seats. You're probably asking yourself, how do their techniques work? And how do they know whom to contact in an effort to encourage someone to vote for a Republican candidate versus a Democratic candidate? So to move on, I would like to play a short video. Next slide, please. But just to say that if you are with young children or you don't want them to hear some of the language in this video, maybe just mute the video for the next 45 seconds or so, but otherwise we're free to proceed to the video. All right, so the video that you just watched was a video from Detroit showing protesters in the days following the death of George Floyd, protesting police violence. I just want to take a quick detour now to talk about something else, maybe an experience some of you have had before. If you've ever taken a flight to a new city, I don't know, like Berlin, for example, and once your plane landed, turn on your phone, some of you may have seen a push notification from a service like Uber saying, tap here to call an Uber. The way that works is that Uber uses something called a geofence. A geofence is just a virtual perimeter around a point of interest. And Uber has geofenced the airport, and that allows Uber to send that push notification, that message, only to people at the airport and not anyone else. They want to exclude people who live nearby. They want to exclude people who happen to be nearby but not actually at the airport. They want to send that message only to people at the airport, and they do that through this geofence that allows them to target this message only to people at the airport itself. Now, next slide, please. It turns out that Field Team 6 actually employed a geofence to geofence the actual route of the protest in Detroit. And doing so allowed them to capture information on who was actually protesting. It turns out that this very likely enabled them to harvest the mobile IDs of all the protesters. It's also very likely that they're paying for ads, of course. So if they're encouraging people to register to vote, they don't want to pay for ads for people who've already registered to vote. They only want to show these ads to people who have not yet registered to vote. So in addition to geofencing the actual route of the protest itself, it's likely that they harvested people's mobile IDs and then targeted their ads only to people who were not yet registered to vote. Operating under the assumption, of course, that if there were people out there protesting police violence, they would be sympathetic towards registering to vote as Democrats. And what's interesting here, next slide, please, is that Field Team 6 didn't just do this in Detroit. They did it the exact same thing in a number of key battleground states in the United States. So they did it in Raleigh, North Carolina, Tallahassee, Florida, Houston, Texas, all places that might end up playing really crucial roles in this year's presidential election and this year's Senate outcomes. And during the time of the pandemic, this world of online campaigning has really intensified. Yes, people are out on the streets, but online campaign events are happening fewer and fewer. And so campaigns themselves and outfits like Field Team 6 have been shifting more heavily towards online means of achieving their goals. And it turns out that where you go says a lot about what you value. Do you go on a Friday night to a gay bar? Are you shopping at an organic grocery store? If so, that might say something about your attitudes towards environmental issues. And of course, political entities, political groups can use that information to tailor their messaging to you. And of course, your protests can reveal a lot about your political beliefs. And because of technology nowadays, that has enabled private companies to monitor this activity at scale. Next slide, please. And I think there are a couple of key questions here. Even if you agree with the cause, even if you're sympathetic to what the protesters are advocating for, and even if you agree that what Field Team 6 is doing, encouraging people to register to vote as Democrats, even if you're sympathetic to all of that, what does this say about the level of surveillance that we've grown accustomed to? What does it mean that even progressive outfits are celebrating the use of these tactics? And of course, how could technology like this be abused? What's preventing a government from geofencing the next protest that you attend? Next slide. All of this technical infrastructure enabling these capabilities is hidden. If you look at Field Team 6 website, this is a screenshot from their website. They talk about empowering volunteers, having fun, partisan voter registration. But I don't think those protesters in that video had any idea that their physical presence at this protest in a key swing district in the United States was being registered, logged, and then being used to communicate political ideas to them. But in fact, the industry, next slide please, is quite open about its goals and aims here. This is a screenshot from Facebook, which it took down in the days following the Cambridge Analytica scandal. But Facebook had on its advertising case study, a case study about their reaching and influencing Mexican voters. Next slide, please. Google as well speaks quite openly about how political ads and voter content influence voter opinion. There's nothing really quite covert about this. It's operating quite out in the open. And next slide, please. I want to close with a tweet from Brad Parscale. He was Trump's former campaign manager. And in the days before Trump's rally in Tulsa. This was Trump's first physical campaign rally after the coronavirus pandemics really started in the US. He tweeted out, just passed 800,000 tickets, biggest data haul and rally sign up of all time by 10x. Saturday is going to be amazing. What I find interesting here is that Brad Parscale is not tweeting out upcoming rally, what a great chance for Americans to hear Donald Trump's vision for the future, what a great opportunity for Donald Trump's base to connect with him. He's writing biggest data haul and rally sign up by 10x. I think it speaks to how the logic of politics is changing. It's becoming more about an optimization, almost like a technical problem. And in this logic of optimizing, I think we should be asking ourselves, who's defining what optimal really is? Next slide. Just in closing, I want to say that the approach that we've taken to this topic at Tactical Tech is one that operates outside of exclusively just Facebook, but looking at the larger influence industry, operating outside of just the US. Although, of course, because today is the day of the American elections, I've drawn heavily on examples from the United States. And importantly, nothing here has anything to do with disinformation. In fact, these are products and services that operate openly on the market that are considered totally fair game and legitimate. And I believe that even without worrying about things like disinformation, these products and services give us reason to feel concerned about the integrity of our elections. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, we've tried to take an international approach to this topic, and we've worked with local stakeholders, academics, journalists, researchers, civil society organizations, technology specialists in a number of countries to understand how personal data is being used for political purposes in a number of different countries. And I've had the pleasure of working with Tatyana on understanding how personal data is being used in Ukraine. And she will take it from here and enlighten you about how our personal data is being used in the Ukrainian context. Thank you.
Varun, thank you very much. This was very interesting. I hope my presentation, the audience finds it equally as interesting. So my presentation is very much focused on Ukraine, specifically on the use of personal data in 2019 parliamentary elections, and a little bit on the recent 2020 local elections. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before I move any further, I would like to give some credit to the organizations that I collaborated with when doing the research. And those were two Ukrainian NGOs, in particular Digital Security Lab and our election watchdog Opora and the Tactical Technology Collective, of course. Next slide. So why we chose to focus on 2019 parliamentary elections? It could be said that the presidential campaign prompted, specifically probably Volodymyr Zelensky's campaign, prompted the widespread use of digital political campaigning methods, and these elections were particularly impacted by these targeted political communications. At that point, the audience for such communications in Ukraine was over 21 million internet users, and 13 million of those users were on Facebook. Moreover, 23%, actually a bit over 23% of Ukrainians were receiving their news primarily from social networks. And according to Mikhailo Fedorov, who was at that time Zelensky's chief digital campaign strategist, and now Ukraine's Vice Prime Minister of Digital Transformation, Zelensky campaign amassed 180,000 subscribers on its Telegram channel, recruited over 608,000 volunteers online, and ran over 3,200 digital advertising campaigns. Moreover, when targeting voters, they segmented them into 32 different categories, in particular according to gender, age, professional affiliation, or political interest. And when the parliament was dissolved shortly following the presidential elections, that basically gave parties very little break between the two election campaigns, and they just, most of them that ran presidential candidates, just reoriented all of the approaches and techniques that they used during the presidential elections to the parliamentary campaign. Next slide, please. Thank you. And well, several civil society organizations have produced detailed reports about 2019 online political campaigning in Ukraine and its implications. There was really no investigation made into the use of personal voter data in elections and the issues that are arising at the intersection of privacy and digital campaigning. And therefore, the purpose of this research was specifically to fill this gap, and we tried to do it by looking at the treatment of personal voter data by 5 political parties elected to the parliament in 2019. In particular, we investigated online data collection practices used by these parties during the campaigning period, a look at their official websites and social media, including popular messaging platforms. We reviewed these practices against the existing legal framework and the party's own claims about how voters' personal data was being collected and processed by them. And as well as we tried to put all of this in the context of digital campaign methods and tools utilized by political actors during the 2019 elections. Next slide, please. So parliamentary parties campaigned very actively on the 6 most popular social networks in the country and actively used online advertising capabilities of various online platforms, from Facebook and Instagram to YouTube or Google. However, Facebook was the only platform that offered some transparency with regard to political advertisements, and in fact remains to be the one tech platform that offers the most transparency in this regard. And based on Facebook data, in 2019, during the parliamentary elections, all contestants, all political parties that participated ran 40,427 targeted political ads, and spent over $1,800,000 US on this advertising. Next slide, please. So other tools and methods that have been used during the 2019 elections included mailing lists, third-party tracking, chatbots, and custom mobile applications. Varun talked a little bit about A/B testing. We did not see that parties in Ukraine actively used A/B testing because most of the time they would use much smaller lists of such scale that it wouldn't make much sense to do widespread A/B testing. However, when, for example, running ads, political parties took full advantage of such targeting instruments as Facebook's lookalike audience and custom audience. Some parties also actively utilized mailing lists and using some third-party providers of such services. Next slide, please. So all 5 parliamentary parties collected voters' personal data through various registration forms on websites and social media, as well as used cookies and other methods. And based on the data from the websites of just 2 political parties, Servant of the People and European Solidarity, at least 102,000 people registered online with these 2 parties alone, and they were registering as prospective members, supporters, and volunteers. And I would like to add that while the Ukrainian electoral legislation doesn't really provide for any particular safeguards of voters' personal information, our country's personal data protection law sets some mandatory requirements for automated processing of personal data, which should also apply to online practices of political parties and candidates. Next slide, please. And so in this slide, I tried to outline some of the main principles set in our data protection law. And one of the such main principles is principle of consent, which is the primary basis for electronic processing of voters' personal data. And consent must comply with certain characteristics. It has to be voluntary, which means the voters should be able to decide on their own whether to provide the data or not, and what information they should provide. Consent should be unambiguous, which means that people should personally, for example, put the check mark in the consent box, indicating that they do agree to their data being collected. The consent must be informed, which means that before consenting, voters must receive comprehensive information about what kind of data is being collected and for what purpose. And it should be preliminary, which means that the consent should be given before any data is being collected. Moreover, there are a couple more articles in this law that are quite interesting for our research purposes. For example, Article 7 foresees some enhanced protection of data on citizens' political preferences, which Ukrainian law identifies as sensitive data. Article 6 says that the data must be collected only for specific and lawful purposes of processing, and should be done with consent of data subjects. And Article 24 foresees some protection of data from unlawful access, accidental loss, destruction, and so on, which means that the parties should implement some basic protection on their website. Next slide, please. So when we looked at the parliamentary parties' websites, there are 5 such parties. We discovered that only 2 of them published privacy policies on their websites at all. 3 parties requested consent of users when collecting and processing their personal data, although one of the parties didn't specify all of the purposes for which such data would be collected. They simply stated that the data will be used for mailing and other purposes, but nevertheless asked users to consent to these other purposes as well. 2 parties offered users to subscribe to the emailing list, and one of them used a third-party provider without telling the users that their data will be shared with this third-party provider. And one party at all did not provide any kind of explanation how is the data that the users are submitting through their website is going to be used at all. Next slide, please. And 4 of the 5 parties used a variety of different analytical and tracking services. Varun already talked a little bit about the third-party trackers. So those are trackers that, for example, can follow users across the internet, see which websites they're using and so on. And those trackers also can share information with not just with the political parties that use those trackers, but also with third parties. For example, trackers and cookies that the political parties installed on their websites shared information with social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and so on for advertising purposes. Next slide, please. Oh, and before I move on to this, I should also mention that only 2 parties even bothered to inform the visitors of the websites that their data is being collected through such cookies and trackers, and none of the parties did it at the moment of the users visiting the website. So also during the research, we did some rather external and limited analysis of the security measures implemented on the websites, but even that analysis showed some security issues. For example, 4 of the 5 websites had some vulnerabilities. One political party failed to use HTTPS protocol on their website, which meant that if anyone was monitoring the connection, the data of all of the users of the website that they were submitting to the party was left out there in the open. Other parties failed to encrypt some parts of their website, and many parties used some outdated modules or software with vulnerabilities that were known at the time. And at least in one case, volunteers successfully hacked the CRM server of the party, which contained the data of all of the supporters of the party. And even though it appears to have been like a friendly attack by Ukrainian hacktivists, it kind of shows the level of security that Ukrainian political parties are used to. Next slide. So also all parties actively campaigned on social media and used a variety of tools to collect data of their voters on social media and outside of the websites. Those tools included all kinds of registration forms, emailing software, electronic petitions, and so on. Next slide. And interestingly enough, even though some parties tried to formulate the privacy policies on their websites and asked for consent on their websites, when they collected people's data on social media, the attempts to do the same were far less consistent and sometimes non-existent. For example, the parties wouldn't link to their privacy policies on the Google Forms that they posted online, or wouldn't ask for people's consent when collecting their data. Next slide, please. The use of chatbots is also illustrative in this regard. At least 2 political parties have used chatbots in 2019 campaign. And in its privacy policy, Telegram notes that other than its own bots, third-party bot developers and their apps are completely independent from the messaging platform, and they should ask users for permission before they access their data that users make available to them through interacting with the bot. We interacted with chatbots of 2 political parties, Golos and Servant of the People, and none of the bots asked us about, asked our consent for collecting the data during interaction before they began such interaction with us, or mentioned any kind of privacy policies of the parties at all. Next slide, please. Okay. So this was the overview of 2019 parliamentary elections. Let's look at 2020 local elections that just happened and see whether anything has changed with regard to the treatment of personal data by political parties and candidates. So firstly, I must say that if anything has changed, it's not the scale of the digital campaigning. The scale of the digital campaigning only grew. According to Facebook library data analyzed by Opora, NGO Opora, the number of political ads published on the platform during the active campaigning period in 2020 nearly doubled comparing to the parliamentary elections in 2019, with parties and candidates spending around $3.1 million US on advertising. And here you can see the top 10 parties that according to their spending on political ads on Facebook. Next slide, please. So out of these top 10 parties that actively campaigned on Facebook, and I must say that parliamentary parties were among them, 9 invited voters to register with them online, mostly via their websites. And only 3 of them outlined how they would process this data in privacy policies on their website, and only 5 asked for users' consent for such processing. If we look at the parliamentary parties, not much has improved in their treatment of the personal data of voters since 2019 elections. One of them finally instituted the HTTPS protocol on its website, but another that had privacy policies removed privacy policies from their website, kind of now leaving voters in the dark with regard to what's happening to their data. And as for social media and services for data collection outside of websites, then the parties mostly continued the same practices that we found problematic in 2019. Next slide, please. And the conversation about data protection in Ukraine would be incomplete if we didn't talk about some other issues of concern that we also outlined in the research. As many of you know, 2020 saw a number of mass personal data leaks online. And the data appears to have come from Ukrainian government registries and a number of commercial databases of some of the biggest enterprises in the country. For a while, it was openly traded online through an anonymous Telegram bot, and another Telegram bot that is selling a smaller subset of personal people's data is still operating online. Moreover, after the 2019 elections, there was some indication of some illicit data sharing between political campaigns and government entities. For example, some users complained about the email that they have used to subscribe to an election campaign of a candidate. Later, to this email messages from the Ministry of Digital Transformation have begun to arrive. So this shows that there could have been a transfer of this contact information between the campaign and the ministry. Next slide, please. So what can be done about this? In the research, we tried to formulate some recommendations for political parties, for policymakers, and for civil society. And for political parties, at the bare minimum, they should formulate some clear data protection, data and privacy policies, and display them on all their digital campaigning platforms and ensure that voters consent before the data is being collected and processed. And also ensure that these policies are applied consistently across all of the different platforms that parties and instruments that parties are using for campaigning. As for Ukrainian lawmakers and election administration, we sometimes hear conversations about introducing such innovations as electronic voting and so on. However, the election legislation that we are using right now still lacks some important clarifications and mechanisms and safeguards pertaining to digital campaigning and protection of voter personal data. For example, it still doesn't recognize digital political advertisement as a form of political campaigning. And at bare minimum, it should recognize this and pay some attention to such issues as proliferation of discrediting or misleading campaigning online, the role of pages not officially affiliated with political contenders that are running political ads, or use of bots and fake accounts. And of course, special attention should be paid to the protection of voters' personal data in the context of political campaigning. Next slide, please. But more importantly, perhaps to our audience, what you as a voter can do to protect your data in the Ukrainian context. I wanted to reference here a guide produced by Tactical Tech called the Data Detox Kit. The overall guide is already available in Ukrainian, but there's a subset of this guide called specifically produced for voters about protection of personal data around elections, which is also very useful, but that is so far available only in English, or at least not available in Ukrainian. But in our day-to-day life, we can be more privacy conscious. The law of Ukraine does not explicitly prohibit combining data from open sources. For example, if people publish their phone numbers online, emails, etc., then this data can be scraped and used. Therefore, we should be conscious about leaving our contact information online, somewhere where it can be openly accessed. Varun talked a little bit about digital listening. So by digital listening, I mean people revealing their political preferences online. We did not see any evidence of this being used for campaigning yet. However, it may have been used already, or it will be used in the near future. Therefore, think about privacy settings, for example, on your social media when you're discussing political topics, if you do not want your political preferences to be later used for targeting purposes. Also, you can customize social media ad preference settings, limiting the amount of data about yourself that is being used for advertising purposes. And it never hurts to be conscious of online trackers and location trackers, tracking that Varun also described in his presentation. And finally, even though there's a limited number of transparency instruments that we have in Ukraine, the Facebook political advertising library is open and available to anyone. And it's very interesting to check what kind of political advertisements are being ran and based on what targeting criteria. Next slide, please. Thank you. Also, when online data is being collected by political contestants, Remember that websites are collecting our data from the moment that we are visiting them, whether the entities that are running these political parties are warning us about it or not. Chances are that there are cookies on the websites and other trackers that will follow us around after visiting the websites. It never hurts to check for the privacy policies on the website. And if the privacy policies are not available, then I encourage you to contact the political party or candidate or campaign and ask them about their data protection policies or their privacy policies. And also, according to the law, data subjects have the right to request deletion of their data. So you can also do that in case you are seeing your data being used in a way that you're not comfortable with. And finally, you can report some abuses or wrongdoing to the Data Protection Authority of Ukraine, which is the Ombudsman's office. And the same applies to the offline data collection. Excuse me. If data is collected about you offline during the political campaigning period, then you can request information about the way this data is being collected and for what purposes and how it's going to be processed. Moreover, according to the law, whoever's collecting your data must first inform you about this and also request that your data will be deleted and not used anymore if you don't want it to be used. And again, you can report any wrongdoing if you encounter it. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you very much. I hope there are some questions and I will be very happy to answer them.
I might just jump in here. It looks like a couple of people have asked some questions after my presentation, Tatyana, while you were in the middle of your talk. And I thought maybe we can just jump straight on in. The first question I saw is from Anna Melanchik. Anna, thanks for your question. Anna asks, thanks for your great presentations. What is your take on COVID-19 contacts tracing mobile applications? Personal data collected by such apps could be used for purposes other than public health, especially in such countries as Ukraine. How do we ensure that personal data collected by such apps is protected? Anna, I think that's a great question. I'm happy you're asking it after my short little presentation on geolocation-based targeting. Obviously, this is such a question that's so relevant right now in this moment with the ongoing pandemic. To answer your question more directly, there are a lot of technical considerations to take into account when making sure that the personal data collected by such apps is protected. You know, is the data stored in an encrypted fashion? Is it collected through a pipeline that's end-to-end encrypted? There are a lot of technical considerations, but I think even considering the question from a level that's not so technical, there are a number of things that we should be doing to ensure that the personal data that these apps collect is protected. First and foremost, I think it's important that the apps that are released respect local data protection laws and privacy laws. For example, the French Data Protection Authority ruled that the contact tracing app in France failed to comply with provisions in GDPR and French data protection law because if someone tested positive, the app worked in such a way that risked revealing their identity to everyone with whom they were sharing information via the app. So first, I think it's important that these apps respect established privacy laws, which exist for a reason. But I also think, speaking more generally, it's really important that we acknowledge that, yes, we are in unprecedented circumstances. These are exceptional times, and that sometimes these do require exceptional measures, so that whatever techniques or methodologies that are employed to contact trace, that they must be temporary, that what is done must be necessary and nothing beyond what is absolutely necessary to contain the spread of the virus, and that in general, that the techniques employed are proportionate to the challenge at hand. We can't then, given the coronavirus, we cannot justify surveillance left and right, but I think the degree of surveillance that we decide to subject ourselves to in an effort to help contain the virus must be proportionate to the scale of the challenge that we're trying to contain. In practice as well, I think that part of this involves digital literacy on the part of the public. I think this will involve a lot of legislative interventions, but also kind of changing product and design practices among the technologists and business people who are developing these technologies. That was just my 2 cents off the top of my head. Tatyana, maybe there's something you would like to add.
Thank you. No, I think that was very good. And that was everything that I would have said, I think. Maybe for the sake of time, I can move on to some of the next questions. I see there was a question about data becoming an increasingly valuable asset for those that control it, how to keep our own independence and not be hooked into political manipulations. I really hope that my last couple of slides gave you some tips on taking control of your personal data, because I believe that taking control of your data is probably the best thing we can do right now to, not to be hooked into political manipulations, of course. As you may have heard, there was an incident in the town of Novi Sanjare around the time when the pandemic has begun in Ukraine, and some of the Ukrainian citizens have been evacuated from China, from Wuhan to Novi Sanjare. And someone got a hold of the phone numbers of people that live in Novi Sanjare and surrounding areas. And overnight, many of those people have been added to Viber chat groups where some panicky messages about the arrival of pandemic to the town have been spread, basically instigating the riots and protests the next day. So this is a perfect example of political manipulation with the use probably illegal use of people's personal data, because still we don't know exactly who was running those chat groups. And if you're interested in learning more about this incident, then Textim made a great investigation about it. And one more thing that we can do, of course, is to raise awareness about the importance of privacy. As you saw from my presentation, right now people don't think about privacy, let's say, so much. And those that are supposed to be protecting our data, sometimes are not very vigilant about it, and therefore we have, or maybe actually are abusing their power and selling people's data illegally. So as we saw from these number of incidents that happened in 2020 with people's personal data. So I think events like this, and this would be also my recommendation to civil society members, events like this that raise awareness about the importance of data protection are probably very important in this regard as well. And I see there are a couple more questions for me, but perhaps Varun, you also have some that you would like to take.
Yeah, definitely. I thought maybe I would just piggyback what you just mentioned in your last question, Tatyana. And assuming that we're okay to maybe just go over, I know this was supposed to end at 6, but maybe we can just take a couple of extra minutes to answer a few more of the questions that are coming in. To add to what Tatyana said, I think that there are a lot of things that you can do. I often think of it like you can fortify your presence online. This could be something like using an ad blocker. You can try to obfuscate or blur your online activity, maybe through the use of something like a VPN. You can try to reduce your digital footprint. Maybe go somewhere sometime without your phone. Your digital footprint will be smaller. You can also try to compartmentalize your digital footprint. So maybe you use one internet browser at work and a separate one at home, and sort of try to separate the trail of, so to speak, digital breadcrumbs you leave behind when you actually use the internet. In general, I think one really good tactic is to try to use open source technology. The reason open source is good is because a community of developers who are operating with no financial stake can audit the technology and ensure that the technology is doing exactly what it says it's doing and nothing more and nothing less. But at the end of the day, I think your decision of how to control your online life and your digital footprint really depends on you. It depends a little bit on your own personal context, who your adversary is. Maybe the adversary could be private companies, maybe it's the government, maybe it's, you never know, maybe it's an abusive spouse or partner. I think it really depends on the particularities and specifics of the situation. But with that in mind, as Tatyana mentioned, I think the Data Detox Kit is a good place to begin, with just providing you some basic options for what you could do. I got quite a long question, Tatyana. Maybe we should tackle this one next. I'm just going to read it out loud. And I have to say, I really like this question because I think it's motivated from a place of real practicality and no nonsense, which I personally really like. So yeah, without any further ado, let's jump into it. This question asker wrote, data probably aren't going to vanish in the near future, quite the contrary. What is your vision for the future regarding this process? Aren't we just seeing a long-term process of speeding up communications of data? Are we just seeing a process of speeding up communications and data aggregation? Yes, we are. Voter files are present in the US politics for dozens of years now, true. Or are we entering a time of new emergent information society and we must invent new approaches to manage this kind of society? What instruments do you recommend? Because I don't think that education about privacy and data security and banning trackers is going to be mainstream in the future. That battle is lost now. I can't imagine a society with such technical and data analytics skills that would throw this into the trash and say privacy first. That's not going to happen. I think that data will proliferate and we must find other ways to manage this kind of data-powered society. I'm probably really mispronouncing Matya's name, but thank you so much for your question. I think it's a great one. This is a question, honestly, I really struggle with myself because I think that this digital revolution has been a revolution in many ways. And a lot of what the standard advice is about, being more privacy aware is very well intentioned, but at the same time, I think you're totally fair to point out it feels totally impractical. If I can just offer my opinion here, I think that one of the paths I see this taking, and one of the real ways in which I envision this data-powered society, as you call it, working, is a world in which private is kind of like a new sort of organic. There are a lot of parallels between the world of digital rights and environmental rights. And just in the same way people today opt for organic foods, I think in the not too distant future, we might have digital products and services that are privacy conscious and privacy aware, that people regard as a sort of luxury good the same way we regard organic foods. What's great about that is I think it could be a mechanism that's very effective. I already think that we see some early signs towards people who have options opting to be more private, opting to not expose so much information about themselves online for the world to see. The downside is that I don't want to live in a world in which privacy is only available to people who can afford it. So I think one of the challenges that we'll have going forward is a world in which privacy and privacy conscious digital services are available, but it might be a little bit of a premium. But that's just my short, brief thoughts in response to your question. I think that that's one mechanism I see by which a lot of these problems might be solved, where there is a clear market incentive to start producing and building technologies that respect people's privacy. I just hope that it won't come at the expense of privacy for people who can't actually financially afford it.
Varun, actually, I got a question that kind of, I think, overlaps a little bit with the question that you just read. This is a question from Christian Wengert, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced the last name myself. What do you think? Are we moving to an inevitable dystopian future of voter manipulation, or are there efficient strategies to curb these trends? Looking at authoritarian European governments and parties, I fear you can't rely on the national regulation and the user's individual responsibility only. So I think, Varun, you largely, I mean, your answer kind of, I think, applies to this question as well. However, I would like to add that it's not just the regulator's job and our individual responsibility, it's also the responsibility of these political parties and voters and the way that they're using our data. And we discussed this with Varun the other day. We were kind of dreaming about political parties and candidates taking a stand and taking a stand for ethical use of data and for privacy conscious campaigning and kind of setting a new standard and winning elections this way. So it's not that everybody has to resort to all of these tactics in order to win elections. There have been parties and candidates that have taken such stance before. For example, campaigns have been won, elections have been won by parties and candidates that refuse to do negative campaigning about their opponents. So it would be really nice to see political parties and candidates telling us, we respect your privacy. This is the way in which we're using your personal data. And these are the ways in which we will not use your personal data. And this is our, this is our stand on this issue. And we as voters, we can hold parties and candidates accountable. I mean, if political parties in Ukraine want my vote, I am going to check whether they have privacy policies on their website. I'm going to check whether they're taking any measures to protect the data that I submit to them in order for them to communicate with me more efficiently, and so on and so forth. So, to sum up, it will be really nice to see the political actors being more responsible with regard to the use of personal data, and voters also more actively kind of keeping them accountable for it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, part of what makes working on this topic so difficult is that it feels like, okay, this issue is over the heads of most voters who are not even aware that this is a problem. Lawyers are depending on private companies to do the right thing and these private companies in turn are just saying, well, we're just doing what consumers and voters want. And you have this sort of collective action problem at the end of the day where no one is really spearheading this cause. And, there are people out there who say too, like, why would any political representative want to tackle this issue? Because the people we have in office nowadays are often those people who use and benefit from all these technologies and all this really invasive voter surveillance. But just like we have political candidates out there who refuse corporate money, or as Tatyana mentioned, candidates who refuse to engage in negative campaigning, I think there's an opportunity for someone to set the bar, just as there is an opportunity to respond to the last question for private companies to say, we're going to operate in a way that's more privacy respecting. And I think in my mind, that's the mechanism by which I see some of this precedent changing. Of course, this technology in the hands of authoritarian regimes is ripe for abuse. And that is, I think, a different ballpark entirely. I think the levers for responding there are very different. But at least in democratic societies, I think there's an opportunity opening for people to set the gold standard. And I think hopefully it's just a matter of time before we see private companies and people seeking political power who set that bar.
So if there are not more questions, it remains for me to say a big thank you to you both, Varun and Tatyana, for these, at the end, at least inspiring words. So I also learned a lot. Again, I'm learning so much in that project, what I have to do with my data, how I have to be aware and consciousness about it. And so I'm a person from the cultural field. Yeah, so that's mostly totally new terrain for me. So, what I also learned, it's not only to be aware of private data policy. So where I have to yeah, to be aware and not to click and to read what is written there about it, but also to see again how easily we can be manipulated where we don't expect it. Yeah, so especially Varun, also in your first part, yeah, about how during an election campaign, informations are presented, or persons or politicians are presented. Yeah. So thank you very much. It was very inspiring, very helpful. And maybe to add, so we recorded that talk. So if I or you also didn't understand anything what was going on in that presentation, or you want to see a slide again, you have the chance to find a little bit later. We have to edit the video, but you can find it on the Data CTRL Center site, so on our online exhibition of the Goethe-Institut website, to see the talk again. So once again, thank you very much, Tatyana, Varun. Thank you, the audience, for listening and watching, and we keep in touch. The next event is following. There will be next week on Friday, it's the 12th of November, there will be a workshop about feminist perspectives on the internet. Yeah, so you can apply for that to take part in that workshop. Women and men, so everybody is invited to take that look. And then in the week after, at the 18th and 19th, there are coming up also events online. You can find more about them out on the web pages of the Goethe-Institut of Data CTRL Center, and also on our Facebook pages. Thank you very much. A nice evening, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.